Adrian Kessler didn't lower his voice when he fired me. He wanted every word to cut through the quiet like a glass shattering on marble. I was standing at the head of a gleaming conference table in the Waldorf Astoria Ballroom in Chicago, a perfect oval lined with 14 CEOs from around the world. Polished pens were poised over contracts worth $2.3 billion. The lighting was warm and golden, the kind of glow you see in photographs meant to celebrate history in the making. This was supposed to be my moment. I had orchestrated every detail, seating arrangements to avoid cultural conflicts, menus curated for every allergy, translators ready to switch languages without a pause. And then Adrian walked in. That smirk, that calculated pause before he spoke. "You won't be needed anymore," he said, just loud enough for the press cameras to catch the shift in the room. I heard the faint clicks of lenses zooming in, the shuffle of a reporter leaning forward. He didn't even look at me after delivering the blow. He turned to his new liaison, someone whose only qualification seemed to be a photogenic smile. The humiliation burned hot in my chest, but my face stayed calm. Years in high-stakes diplomacy had taught me one thing: the most dangerous move is silence. In that moment, I wasn't just losing my job, I was being erased in front of the very people who had trusted me with their billion-dollar deals. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you listening from? Have you ever been blindsided at work by someone who thought they could replace you overnight? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might feel less alone hearing it. For 17 years, I had been the one behind the curtain, making sure every curtain call went flawlessly. Every deal, every summit, every delicate negotiation, I had been there, smoothing egos, translating not just words, but intent, finding common ground where there seemed to be none. I spoke 5 languages well enough to catch the nuance in a sigh, the hesitation in a single word. I had flown overnight to fix agreements teetering on the edge, stayed awake for 48 hours to rework a strategy because one delegate had a sudden change of heart. This wasn't just a job. It was my craft, my stage, my kingdom. And in my kingdom, there were rules. Rules I had built over years of hard lessons. Rule 1, nothing is ever just business. There is always pride, fear, or ambition underneath the surface. Rule 2, the person who keeps the table together holds more power than the one sitting at the head of it. Rule 3, if you do your job well enough, most people will never know you were the one holding it all together. Standing in that ballroom in Chicago, I knew every face, every habit. I could tell you which CEO preferred their water without ice, who needed extra space to gesture, who would refuse to sign if the pen wasn't uncapped for them. I had balanced those details like fine crystal, and I had done it so well that Adrian thought he could walk in, pull me out of my own room, and the whole thing would keep running. As I looked around, I noticed something small, a subtle exchange of glances between 2 of the CEOs. It wasn't sympathy, it wasn't pity, it was recognition. They knew this wasn't just about replacing me with someone else, it was about undoing the very balance that made this table possible. Adrian thought this was his moment to take control. He had no idea he was already standing on a fault line I had built years ago. And as I took a slow breath, I realized I was ready to let him find out exactly what happens when you break the rules in my kingdom. Adrian kept talking, spinning his speech about fresh vision and a new era for the company, while the photographers kept snapping. But I stopped listening to his words. My attention shifted to the edges of the table, to the people who actually mattered here, the ones who had been in the trenches of these negotiations with me. Mrs. Han from Seoul sat with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her face neutral. But her eyes followed Adrian for a moment, then flicked toward me, just once, a deliberate, measured glance. I had seen that look before in boardrooms, at treaty signings. It meant, I see you. I'm not forgetting what you've done here. Next to her, Mr. Patel from Mumbai adjusted his glasses. To anyone else, it was nothing, but I knew better. He was buying time. It was the same move he used before rejecting a proposal outright, a way of signaling to his own team to hold their ground. His gaze drifted my way for a fraction of a second, the corner of his mouth tightening just enough to register. These weren't gestures anyone else in the room would notice, but they landed like small anchors in a storm. And they told me two things. First, not everyone at this table was blindly buying in to Adrian's performance. Second, some of them were already calculating the cost of his decision. I let my eyes sweep around the room, slow and casual, the way you might look at the decor to avoid making a scene. The French delegate's pen stayed capped. The Norwegian CEO leaned slightly toward his interpreter, murmuring something too low for the mics to catch. On the surface, it was business as usual, polite smiles, occasional nods. But underneath, the current was shifting. The temperature in the room was changing in degrees only a few of us could feel. Adrian hadn't noticed, not yet. But as those small signals stacked up, I knew one thing for certain. The balance of this meeting was no longer in his favor, and soon he was going to find out just how quickly a room can turn. Adrian knew how to work a crowd, I'll give him that. He gestured toward the tall woman standing just behind him, her sleek hair catching the ballroom lights, her designer suit clearly picked to impress the cameras. This, he announced with a sweeping hand, is our new liaison for global partnerships, a fresh face to lead us into the next chapter. The reporters leaned forward. A few flashes went off. She smiled, polished, practiced, but just shy of genuine. I'd seen that look before, too. It was the smile of someone who didn't yet know how much they didn't know. I stayed still, my hands resting on the back of the chair I'd been standing behind moments earlier. Adrian was baiting the room, dangling this image of modern leadership like a shiny lure. Younger, trendier, easier to put on magazine covers. And to the untrained eye, it was working. But I also knew the knife hidden inside that bait, because she wasn't just a replacement, she was a message. To the board, to the press, and especially to me, we don't need you anymore. What Adrian didn't realize was that this kind of game cuts both ways. You can dress up a photo op all you want, but if the foundation under it is fragile, all it takes is one small shift for the whole stage to collapse. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second, just long enough to betray a flicker of uncertainty. She didn't know where to stand, which CEOs to acknowledge first, or which handshakes would offend the others if skipped. All the things I had spent years perfecting were suddenly in the hands of someone who thought this was just another networking event. I could feel the tension tightening in the room, invisible but very real. The bait was out there glinting in the light, but I could already see the first hairline cracks forming. Adrian was too busy basking in his own performance to notice, and that was exactly how I needed it to stay. Most people in that room thought the memorandums of understanding were just stacks of paper waiting for signatures. They didn't know what was buried in the fine print, the safeguards I'd fought for line by line in meetings that stretched past midnight. One of those safeguards was Clause 22. Clause 22 wasn't flashy. It didn't read like a threat. But it was a quiet lock on the entire deal. If the designated liaison was replaced before the final signing, every single MOU became null and void. No exceptions, no appeals. I'd insisted on it years ago, back when we were just starting to expand globally. I told the partners it was to protect them from instability, to make sure no one could swap out the person they'd been negotiating with for months and slip in someone they didn't trust. They agreed because they knew relationships like these weren't built in a day. They took years, sometimes decades. Now sitting there in Chicago, Adrian had no idea that by introducing his fresh face before the ink was dry, he'd set that lock in motion. The very people he was trying to impress had signed those agreements knowing exactly what Clause 22 meant, and I had made sure they remembered it. I glanced toward Mr. Patel. He didn't smile, but he dipped his chin slightly, just enough for me to know he hadn't forgotten. Across the table, Mrs. Hand's fingers tapped once on her folder, slow and deliberate. She knew, too. Adrian kept talking, completely unaware that the ground beneath him wasn't solid. It was the same ground I'd laid years ago, and I could already feel it starting to shift. They thought this was just a ceremonial swap of faces. They didn't realize the rules of the game had already been written, and they were playing straight into them. And as I listened to Adrian's voice echo off the high ceilings, I knew it was only a matter of time before Clause 22 stopped being words on paper and became something they couldn't ignore. Clause 22 was my first lock, but like any structure worth protecting, I never relied on just one. My second lock wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the system itself, a piece of security most people didn't even know existed. Every single one of those contracts had to be digitally signed through a secure encryption protocol. And the hardware token that generated that signature, it was in my possession. My name, my credentials, my biometric ID. Without all three, the system wouldn't release the final validation key. I'd learned early in my career that in high-stakes negotiations, control over the process can matter more than control over the people. You can charm a boardroom, sway a vote, or bluff through a press conference, but if you can't get the system to register a deal as complete, it's nothing but a stack of expensive paper. When Adrian paraded his new liaison into the room, he assumed it was a clean handoff. He probably thought she could just sign her name on the dotted line and bask in the glory. What he didn't realize was that the signature line might as well have been locked behind a vault door, and I was the only one with the combination. I'd designed it that way for a reason. Not to hoard power, but to ensure that no one, not even a new CEO, drunk on his own ego, could bypass the person who had actually built the trust this deal relied on. Across the table, I caught a faint nod from the head of our legal counsel. She knew about the lock. She also knew what would happen if anyone tried to force their way around it. Instant system alert escalation to outside counsel and an official breach report to all signatory parties. Adrian was still talking, smiling for the cameras, oblivious to the fact that his entire performance was balancing on a signature only I could give, and I had no intention of handing it over. Not yet. I didn't make a scene when Adrian told me to leave. Instead, I stepped back from my chair, rested my hand on the polished wood for a moment, and simply let the silence breathe. That's when the first sound came, the faint scrape of a chair leg against the marble floor. I glanced over and saw Mr. Patel standing. Not abruptly, not with any dramatic gesture, just standing, straightening his jacket and resting his hands on the folder in front of him. Then, from the far end, Bahan placed her pen down, deliberately. The cap clicked shut, echoing faintly in the cavernous ballroom. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. It spread slowly like a ripple in still water. One delegate adjusted his headset, then removed it entirely. Another closed his folder and pushed it a few inches forward, as if to say, "We're done for now." The interpreters, professionals trained to blend into the background, began gathering their notes. Adrian kept speaking oblivious. His voice rose slightly, trying to fill the space. But the space was already full, not with words, but with the weight of unspoken decisions. I stayed quiet, my eyes moving from face to face, cataloging each small act of dissent. These people didn't need to shout to make their point. They were seasoned negotiators. They knew that sometimes the loudest protest is the one no microphone can pick up. Across the table, the Norwegian CEO leaned toward his interpreter and murmured something. The interpreter nodded once, set her pen down, and folded her arms. The message was clear: we're not moving forward like this. Adrian was still playing to the cameras, smiling too broadly, unaware that the stage beneath him was shifting inch by inch. And as the quiet rebellion took shape, I knew we'd reached the point of no return, the moment where silence had more power than any speech could. What Adrian didn't realize was that once a room starts turning against you, there's no pulling it back. And this room had already turned. It happened so quietly you could almost miss it, the moment the lock clicked into place and the whole structure started to collapse. Mr. Patel was the first to break the stillness. He closed his folder with a calm finality, then looked directly at Adrian. "Without our designated liaison," he said, voice steady, "Clause 22 applies." The words hung in the air like a low hum. Adrian's smile faltered just a fraction, but he quickly tried to smooth it over. "Let's not get caught up in technicalities," he replied, his tone light but his shoulders stiff. From across the table, Mrs. Hahn didn't raise her voice, but her next sentence was like a blade slicing through the air. "Technicalities are why these agreements exist." She stood, adjusted her blazer, and with a short nod to her team, began gathering her things. One by one, the others followed. Chairs slid back, pens were set down, interpreters packed their headsets. The room's energy shifted from staged diplomacy to deliberate withdrawal. Cameras flashed, trying to capture faces, but no one looked at them. I stayed where I was, watching as the Norwegian CEO paused by my chair. "We'll resume when the original liaison is restored," he said simply, before walking out. Adrian's voice got sharper, calling for people to sit back down, telling them we could work this out. But the momentum was already gone. The deals, the photo ops, the perfectly staged narrative, all of it was slipping through his fingers like water. From my seat, I could see his reflection in the polished table. The smirk was gone now, replaced by the realization that the room no longer belonged to him. And as the last of the delegates stepped out the door, closing with a soft but final click, I knew the detonation was complete. The blast wasn't loud, but it was irreversible. What Adrian didn't know yet was that the aftershock was going to be much, much worse. By the time Adrian left the ballroom, the story had already escaped the building. The press didn't need an official statement. They had the footage. Delegates walking out in unison. Empty chairs where there should have been signatures, and Adrian frozen mid-sentence as the cameras caught the exact moment he lost control of the room. Within an hour, headlines were everywhere. 2.3 billion deal collapses in Chicago global partners walk out after sudden leadership swap. Clause 22 triggers corporate meltdown. On the financial networks, anchors were replaying the walkout on loop, analyzing every expression, every movement. Commentators speculated on internal power struggles, legal breaches, and whether the company's stock could survive the blow. By the closing bell, shares had plummeted 23%. Inside the building, Adrian's PR team was in full panic mode. I could hear the muffled arguments through the thick conference room doors. "No one uses the words void or withdrawn," one voice said sharply. "Then what do we call it?" another snapped back. "Call it a procedural pause," someone suggested, like dressing up a car crash as a traffic delay. But outside, the narrative was already set. Reporters were waiting in the lobby, shoving microphones at anyone with a badge. Social media was chewing on the story, posting still frames of Adrian's face when he realized what was happening. My phone buzzed nonstop, not from the company, but from contacts around the world, sending me links, screenshots, and in some cases, congratulations. I stayed quiet. There was no need to add my voice. The beauty of a self-inflicted wound is that you don't have to twist the knife, you just watch. Still, I knew this was only the first wave. The media could destroy reputations, but the real damage, the kind that ends careers, would come from the people Adrian had just alienated. And those people were already making calls. It started less than an hour after the ballroom doors closed. I was still in the lobby watching the revolving doors spin with departing guests and reporters when my phone rang. The caller ID read Han Ji-yoon. Her voice was calm, almost casual. "We'll be moving forward with our own initiatives," she said, "but only if you lead them. Independent, full authority. Name your terms. No small talk, no hedging, just an offer laid out like a well-played opening move in chess. Before I could even process it, another notification lit up my screen, an email from Rakesh Patel. It was short, deliberate. We have capital ready. We'd like you on board, not as a consultant, but as the architect. Call me today. It wasn't just flattery. These were seasoned executives who didn't waste words or risk their reputations lightly. They had seen the collapse in real time and understood something Adrian never did, that I was more than a name on an org chart. I was the bridge they trusted, the one who'd spent years earning what no flashy rebrand could buy. By the third message, this time from the Norwegian CEO, I stopped pretending it was coincidence. The offers weren't trickling in, they were converging. Not because they needed a warm body to replace a failed deal, but because they knew that deals could be rebuilt if they started with the right foundation. And for them, that foundation was me. It's a strange feeling being ousted one moment and courted the next. Part vindication, part responsibility. Because with every offer came a question not from them, but from myself. Was I ready to step into something bigger, or was I about to trade one kind of battlefield for another? I slipped the phone back into my bag, the weight of those decisions pressing in. Somewhere upstairs, Adrian was probably still trying to salvage what was left. But down here, my next chapter was already beginning. 1 week later, I was standing in a corner office overlooking the East River. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, the afternoon light catching on the water like liquid silver. The space was quiet, except for the low hum of the city below. No buzzing phones, no frantic assistants rushing in with urgent updates. This was my new desk. My name was already on the glass door, not under a job title handed down by someone else, but as the principal in my own right. The offers I'd accepted weren't about taking over someone's scraps, they were about building something from the ground up on my terms. I ran my hand along the edge of the desk, solid oak, smooth and cool to the touch. There were no piles of paperwork yet, just a single leather-bound folder in the center. Inside were preliminary drafts from Han Patel and the Norwegian CEO, all waiting for my input. Not one of them had set conditions on me. Every clause was left open for my revision. That was the trust we were starting with. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Henrik, the Norwegian CEO, stepped in with a faint smile. In his hand, he carried something wrapped in velvet. "You left this behind," he said, placing it gently on the desk. I unwrapped it to find a black Montblanc pen, the same one he'd set down on the table in Chicago when he walked out. "Thought you might want to use it for the first signature here," he added. I turned the pen over in my fingers, feeling the weight of it. Not just metal and ink, but the quiet, deliberate choices that had led me here. Henrik glanced at the folder on my desk. "Shall we?" he asked. And as I reached for the first page, I couldn't help but think, some victories aren't loud. They just change the view from your desk forever. In the weeks that followed, the dust around Adrian's spectacular failure never really settled, at least not for him. The board launched an internal review, the press kept digging, and the partners he'd alienated didn't return his calls. Eventually, word came down that he'd stepped aside for the good of the company. Everyone knew what that meant. For me, things moved in a different direction. The coalition I'd built, Han Patel, Henrik, and others, became the backbone of a new network. We weren't tied together by a logo on a letterhead, but by trust, the kind you can't fake, can't buy, and can't replace overnight. Every project we touched moved faster, with fewer politics and more results. And I didn't have to fight for a seat at the table anymore, because now I owned the table. Looking back, I realized something important. The real power was never in the title I held or the office I sat in. It was in the value I'd built over years, the relationships I'd nurtured, and the quiet leverage I'd prepared long before I ever needed it. Adrian thought he could take my place in a day. What he didn't understand is that you can replace a nameplate, but you can't replace a foundation. If there's a lesson here, it's this: protect the work you build, even when things feel stable. Sometimes the best defense isn't loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's the quiet confidence of knowing you've set the terms before anyone else even realized there were rules. Because in the end, titles change, faces change, but the person who holds the trust will always hold the real power. What about you? Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to erase your place only to find out you were the one holding it all together?